All right. Chapters 25 through 29. So to review, I'll just kind of walk through 25. So part one here, Marx gives us a quick reminder of what C over V means, which is constant over variable capital. So calling this ratio the value composition. And just to he clarifies some of his terminology here, right? So technical composition just means um, a ratio here is, organic composition is, I think, what he says, the actual calculable one, right? So it's two numbers of the same unit, constant and variable capital. But another way to think of the technical composition is means of production over labor power, right? These are the two things that you need to invest in if you want to do a capital. Um, of course, these ratios will depend on which branch of production you're in, and they're going to differ based on the branch of production. But you can always do like an average across multiple firms to try and get like general picture, for example, of like what a given branch is. You can even scale up and do that for the whole economy. Like he says, the total social capital of a country is the average of the branch compositions, which is the average composition of the whole thing, all the capital in the whole country. Is sort of an average of all of the component parts. Um, okay, so some implications here. So first of all, the growth of our total social capital means the growth of the working class. It's just basically a direct deduction from some of the earlier stuff we were talking about, right? We know value is socially necessary labor time, obviously comes from workers doing labor, um, and capital is self-valorizing value. Therefore, you want more self-valorizing value, you need more workers to produce that value. It's pretty much it's as simple as that. Um, so in chapter 23, which is called simple reproduction, Marx introduces the idea of like, a regardless of your economic system or your mode of production, you might say, the bare minimum that it has to achieve is reproduction. So that means replacing your means of production. Right, equipment breaks down. You need more raw materials every year to, even if we're just breaking even, right? If or even a zero growth context where we make the same stuff this year as we did last year, you even in that context, that's what Marx calls reproduction. You're just doing the same thing, or you're replacing what you have already made. Um, so reproduction, which basically keeps everyone in the society alive and is required for society to function. That think of that as like the motor force that is like of any uh, mode of production. Every mode of production has to at least achieve a simple reproduction level, and then so capitalism specifically as a mode of production is not super focused on reproduction. It's part of the system, of course, but what it's really after is accumulation. Now, accumulation is what Marx calls reproduction on an expanded scale or expanding scale. Um, Therefore, accumulation also means expanded reproduction of the classes, specifically the proletariat, our wage laborers, and working class in general, basically. Um, so, in order to constantly produce more capital than the year before, you also need to expand workforce, or at least there's some caveats on that. We'll get to that because that's maybe too simple of a model. In fact, I think Marx even criticizes some of the other political economists that he constantly shitting on for making that incredibly simplistic deduction, right? That we've all heard before, which is like, oh, if the economy grows, there'll be more jobs or something like that. If capital gets its way, then the working class will also benefit. Um, Obviously, we're going to find out why that is not the case in a bit. Though we all kind of understand that not to be the case. Marx also introduces the idea of the business cycle or boom and bust cycle, whatever you want to call it. So in the part one, he gives like a very basic version of it, which he sort of deconstructs a little bit later on. So his main distinction here is that wages fluctuate as a function of the demand for labor, not the other way around. In fact, so he basically criticizes, I think, mostly Malthus, I want to say, maybe some other guys, where they basically said it was the opposite, right? They said, oh, well, the demand for labor actually fluctuates based on wages. But Marx is like, that doesn't even make sense because it is the capitalists who decide not only the wages, but also the demand for labor. But the demand for labor is really what's important because that is ultimately what capital needs to reproduce itself and to accumulate. The accumulation requires or generates, I should say, like a demand for labor. And that this is actually what determines wages. And so when you have for example, a period of rapid growth, your demand is going up because capital needs more and more labor to valorize itself. And so basically you need more capital basically needs workers to get jobs, and so that actually makes wages go up. And then when you have a downturn, the bust is when demand falls because now capital contracts and it can't grow as rapidly, so it doesn't need as many people. You're actually going to have layoffs, and in addition to layoffs, you might also see your wages fall. So it can kind of be a double-edged sword. And I think we're all vaguely familiar with this in the real world, in our lifetimes, right? It's like we all know that when a bust happens, everyone, like the working class, gets absolutely fucked over a barrel. It is not good. So, yeah, the business cycle does not serve the working class at all. Okay, so get back to some number crunching here. So one of the other aspects that we talked about earlier in chapter 15, the other really, really big one, was all about machinery and kind of large-scale industry. Marx wants to remind us now, this is, I think, getting into part two. Marx wants to remind us that capitalists are constantly investing in machinery, in more efficient means of production, methods of increasing productivity, etc. So what's happening is that the ratio of means production over labor power is rising. In other words, we're buying way more means production than we're buying labor power. Therefore, this ratio C over V is also increasing. We're investing more in constant capital than we are in variable. So if ratio is rising, this ratio rises less than this ratio because the per unit value of the means of production declines. I think ultimately that's basically because again, machines can be used by like multiple people at once, so you may not need to buy a ton of machines because they're actually replacing workers. And I mean, you still also means of production are potentially getting cheaper over time as techniques improve, technology improves, all that fun stuff. Okay. So as our productivity of labor is increasing by this ratio, um, this can also happen with more cooperation on large scale. So I guess some maybe you just said this part actually. But yeah, it's the large systems of machinery where you have a bunch of people using one machine, for example, to keep it running 24/7. You're using more and more natural forces as science gets better. We're just learning more and make things more efficient, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so another aspect of accumulation that he introduces here in section 2 is there's two ways of accumulating, basically, according to Marx, are the two primary ways we call it. So we've got concentration and centralization. I'm a little bummed that they're so similar because it's easy to get them mixed up. But for now, concentration means basically it's a little more of like the standard growth of capital that Marx has been analyzing. And so this basically just means when when you make your profit through sales and you reinvest it into your production process as capital for the purposes of making new capital, that is concentration. So it's basically like a large mass of capital that is growing itself through the exploitation of labor. That is concentration. Then we have centralization, which is when you have an existing capital that basically devours other smaller capitals, or maybe not so small. But we're familiar with this through mergers, takeovers, basically creating monopolies and defeating your opponents in the market and buying all their shit and buying them out of business. That is centralization. Both of these things serve to increase capital, or when you have an individual capital, you can grow it in one of these two ways or both. And in fact, I think most of the time, the controllers of these capitals, the capitalists, are seeking to do both of these things pretty much simultaneously at as much as they can. Right, so they're constantly hunting down smaller capitals, smaller competition to snuff out and sort of take their, if not take their means of production, because I don't actually think that happens a ton. One aspect, or sorry, I should have meant, what I should have said is not means of production, because I was going to say they do steal their means of production with a caveat. They don't typically steal their equipment nowadays, right? Like imagine a startup company, right? They don't have much in terms of capital investment usually. And so if you have a much, much larger competitor who buys them out, what they're really buying is probably their intellectual property. They may even poach their workers, right? So if they've got like qualified people who are very good at their job, the larger company will just hire them instead and essentially kill the smaller company. That can happen too, and that basically is that is essentially stealing someone else's shit. That's one way also centralize. And I've talked about this before, but like you see this type of activity in across the board in a lot of industries, but it's especially frustrating and heartbreaking to see in, for example, like renewable energy technologies or kind of anything that would be like beneficial to like sort of a green transition, so to speak. A lot of that IP and that technology, and also the experts who work on that stuff, that all of that stuff gets devoured by, you guessed it, fossil fuel companies. So whether it's poaching kind of the best and brightest out of in those fields, or when you do have these startups, even if they do attract like an initial wave of investment, they are just so unable to compete with how titanic the fossil fuel capitals truly are. And it's usually too large of a temptation to take the buyout from a larger company, because you're basically selling just an idea or like a patent or a license or something in exchange for probably a shit ton of money and maybe a cozy job. So unfortunately, that does happen quite a bit, but effectively, it's just killing your competition in the cradle. Um, and at the same time, you're centralizing your own assets by just snapping up everyone else's. Yeah, we see this all the time, basically. I'm trying to say, pay attention. Okay, let's keep going. As total invested capital, which is C plus V, rises, so does the demand for labor. But our ratio of organic composition, C over V, of the total social capital rises quicker than social wealth. Okay, so this is basically due to centralization, or one of the reasons is due to centralization. Um, so what he says is that the demand for labor, which is V, um, falls relatively to the magnitude of the total capital. So, and as a result, as the working population is growing, capital produces a relatively redundant or surplus population. Growth of this surplus population involves extrusion of workers, so firing people, laying off, increased difficult, and then consequence of that is you have difficulty absorbing all these workers, and you tend to have more violent fluctuations in the economy. This is our industrial reserve army, Marx calls. So yeah, this is definitely an interesting observation from Marx. But I mean, as far as I know, there has pretty much never been any point in capitalist history where there's been like total, complete employment. I mean, maybe like during the world wars, you got, especially World War II, you may have gotten pretty close, since you had such an enormous portion of the working class drafted into the military. So they're not really producing, like they're not really working, quote unquote. Um, and at least in World War II, and I know in the States at least, you had um, a huge influx of women into the workforce to kind of fuel the war machine, essentially, because like somebody's got to make all the weapons and so forth, um, and keep the economy running, basically. But that's, I think that might be like one of the only exceptions in capitalist history. It definitely wasn't it wasn't due to a good thing. Let's put it that way. It was an outright crisis in that sense. So, um, yeah. So Marx keeps going on about this industrial reserve army of labor. So he calls this the law of population, specifically under capitalism, is such that workers produce not only capital, accumulated capital, but they're also in the process producing their own means of their redundancy. Um, and this kind of makes sense, right? Because a lot of, not all of the working class, but a good chunk of the working class is constantly reproducing the means of production, um, or gathering the means of production through extractive processes, raw materials, basically. And in this process, right, they are accumulating more and more capital, which gets reinvested as a means of production and machinery, automation, better tools, better equipment, better science, whatever. And pretty much consistently, that typically reduces the number of required workers, which is what it means to be redundant. And I think we can kind of think about this a modern example, at least that some people are. Um, I mean, to be fair, like some researchers are genuinely working towards this type of stuff, but like we think about AI, um, a lot of AI systems are good enough to replace quite a bit of labor. Um, you know, whether it be just simple like customer service chat bots or something like. I don't know. It's just the first thing that popped in my head, but that kind of thing. You know, workers who are software engineers generating those, AI chatbots or whatever, are effectively replacing, you know, tons of other workers with something that is not a worker. That's just a machine, basically. Um, and so, this trend basically continues into the modern era. Is what I'm trying to say. Go for it. Yeah, that sounds about right. So, to review our term of accumulation, it's constantly being brought up here. What we see then is a growth in the number of wage workers and a growth industrial reserve army. So if this trend continues, basically, more and more workers become redundant and aren't employed, or at least not sufficiently employed. A reserve army grow, but Marx actually says, well, um, ironically, this industrial reserve army is actually a boon to capital. It is sort of created by capital, but it is also something it needs. Why does it need it? Well, um, you have a huge supply of workers who are available when they are needed. Um, the other thing is that this boom bust cycle or expansion contraction cycle. Um, they either produce when it's contracting or absorb the surplus population expanding, basically at the whim of capital, basically. So if capital doesn't need as many workers right now to valorize itself, all right, fine, we'll just lay a bunch of people off and save some money. If we are really trying to grow super fast for whatever reason, maybe you're in a hot, your industry is like popping off for whatever reason, then you're gonna hire as many people as you can, so forth. And Marx also suggests that the duration of this cycle is variable, but tends to gradually shorten over time. So basically, the boom bust cycle becomes gradually more and more unstable. Um, Now, I don't actually really know if there's been um, an empirical analysis of this, and like this part of the analysis, the part about like the boom bust getting more and more frequent. I don't, because I'm not sure if it really has over time. Like it's been very consistent, I think, over time that it's like every 10 years, give or take, plus or minus a few years. But yeah, I know that it kind of makes sense that basically as you have more and more capital, um, like total social capital, like in other words, the whole. At this point, it's hard for me. Like I know Marx restricts his analysis to like a single country, right? That's usually where he draws the line. But I mean, I think it'd be totally valid to just talk about the like total global capital at this point, because like every corporation is multinational at this point. Um, they all interact across national borders all the time. They don't really give a fuck about, you know, national interests that much. Um, So, but that's the thing, right? Because capital's been accumulating and expanding uh, at a pretty consistent, like 3% a year for the last, I don't know, couple 100 years or something. You have so much capital in circulation now that when you do have a crash, it is like one fucking hell of a crash. So I don't know. I don't know if Marx. I don't think Marx necessarily touches on that aspect of it because he's suggesting that maybe the cycle gets shorter every time, so it happens more frequently. What we might be seeing is that it's not as it may not be as frequent, but when you do have a crash, it is like the crashes get worse over time. They get way more violent and like fuck with even more people every time it does crash. Yeah, pretty much. And I mean, think another thing I would suggest that we all think about is like how many of us are truly independent of capital. Pretty much nobody. Like pretty much nobody is. We cannot. Unfortunately, we're in a position at this stage in history where like it is unavoidable. Whereas when Marx was writing, you still had like a good chunk of the population that didn't actually interact with the capital system that much. Um, like the working class was still relatively small in his era, and you still had quite a few peasants. You still had handicrafts and kind of simple manufacture and sweatshops are still around, I guess. But uh, yeah, you still had. I guess that's kind of what I was hinting at by peasants. But yeah, serfdom, I guess, was still around when Marx is writing. So the point is, um, current like the Industrial Reserve Army, the modern era is probably as large as it's ever been in history. Is kind of what I'm saying because I there's almost nobody on this planet that is like totally free from the dictates of capital or impacted by it in some way, some shape, some form. Even if you are like in a socialist state, for example, they're very well aware that they're surrounded by capitalist states and corporate interests that would love nothing more than to infiltrate their country and exploit the shit out of their population. They're all too aware of that. So yeah, um, yeah, this is one of those predictions. It's like I don't. Maybe there. I'm sure somebody has studied it before, so it'd be interesting. I'd be curious to see if someone wants to look into that. But yeah, uh, basically, another way of putting it is because capital continues to grow, the bubbles that keep bursting get bigger every time. The bubbles keep getting larger and larger and larger. Every time it pops, it gets way more violent. Okay, keep it going here. So again, back to the ratio C over V. Another way of thinking of it is that the means there are so it reduces the means production's capacity to employ workers. Um, so you're spending all your money on means production, not as much money on workers. So it's increasingly difficult to hire people. Um, this basically keeps people out of the workforce intentionally. Intentionally is kind of the key word there. I think I brought this up last time, even though the recording got nuked. But um, every time we see the same old shtick in the election cycles, we're all going to hear it. It's all, oh, jobs, 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 right? They got to bring back jobs, blah, blah, blah. It's like, dude, politicians have almost nothing to do with that kind of stuff. Really, they don't. That is all up to capital, and capital requires a large chunk of the population to be unemployed by design. So there will always be a campaign promise for more jobs, and they will always under deliver because that is part of the system. Uh, so when you aren't hiring as many people, how do you continue to grow your capital? Well, you increase your intensity of labor and overwork and overtime, all this shitty shit that makes people's lives miserable. Um, it makes them hate their fucking jobs. Some of this is speed up, right? I'm sure we've all encountered at some point or another kind of like something that, oh, we need to increase our productivity, or you know time on task, or that kind of shit. That kind of, or everyone should be more mindful, so they spend every waking second on their work, focused on what they're doing. It's like, dude, people just don't operate that way. Break it to you, but whatever. um the other thing that is kind of like a looming, usually they don't verbalize this type of thing, but it's sort of a veiled threat of, you are replaceable. um and us as workers kind of understand that to be the case. Our bosses understand that to be the case. And I'll skip to this really quick because this is like an interesting. We did talk about this last time a little bit, but this is a nice summary of it, right? That when you do have like an increase, let's say you have like a very highly paid industry, it's no surprise that you're going to have a lot of labor try to, a lot of the workforce are going to like compete for those higher paying jobs. So they're going to like leave their lower wage jobs and try to look for higher wage ones. But this sort of heightened competition between workers actually drives wages down in the higher paid industries. So, and this, I think this also tends to be the case, and Marx doesn't talk about this a ton. Um, but even in industries where the wage isn't great, or like the salary isn't great, the profession might be highly desirable. So maybe a lot of people like myself, um, want to eventually become like educators, for example, teachers. And we already know that that's not like a super lucrative career or anything in terms of salary, but it is like a very fulfilling profession for a lot of people. And so there is a competition, like there is competition between workers because there are limited positions in that kind of field. And it's super easy to just be like, oh, there's a whole bunch of you that want this position, great, I'm going to make you all compete for like the lowest wage I can get away with, basically, because you all will take it anyways. um Same thing in like the entertainment industry. That one's sort of notorious for being very ruthless, right? It's sort of this pretty toxic environment where it's sort of like, hey, I can replace your ass with another pretty face like tomorrow, because it is such a competitive and oversaturated industry that you know the actors, or it's not just actors, but anyone in that industry will kind of take jobs at, even with a shitty wage, just because it's something they're very passionate about. So I don't know if Marx talks about that, but the effect is basically the same. Um, Even if it's not wages, it's something about the job makes it more coveted. So yeah, he kind of concludes this section about, and coming back to wages, right? They're determined by fluctuations in demand for labor, which is ultimately decided by capital, not by the workers. He's specifically counter arguing Malthus here, because Malthus is basically saying the workers only have themselves to blame, which is fucking ridiculous. Um, and yeah, like Marx pretty clearly points out, fluctuations in the labor supply are way too slow to meet capital's needs, right? Because like if you have your if you have a population increase, Marx is like, okay, good for you, but like you realize those people won't be able to legally work till for like 16 years or something like that, which is way too long to meet an immediate demand. So Marx's explanation is that you know people getting paid more to have more, and then just immediately using money to, like, I guess, just have kids willy nilly. Um, Marx is like, no, that's ridiculous. That's not how it works. That's not what happens. Um, it would be way too slow. Much easier for capital to just be like, how about I just have a permanent supply of unemployed people I can just poach at any time. Anytime I need it, I can just be like, hey, you unemployed, get in here. I'll give you like $10 an hour. It's much more efficient from the perspective of capital, and in fact, that is actually what happens. So, yeah, get fucked, mouths. All right, now this last section, Marx gives us three groups, I guess, within. Technically, it's four, I guess, but say three main groups within the Industrial Reserve Army, or the surplus population, whatever you want to call it. So we've got the floating population, which are basically like they're older workers, potentially very highly skilled, right? So they've accumulated a lot of experience and kind of expertise. Some of them emigrate out of the. So remember, emigrate is leaving your country to go look for better paying jobs in another country. And sometimes, like, these people get replaced by just like younger workforce. I can imagine, like, maybe jobs with more manual labor that might be more common. He also mentions how large scale industry kind of burns through people really quickly. So their health basically, their health gets shot and is just completely ruined by their horrible working conditions. So it sort of burns through these people really fast, but they're not like, they don't die immediately. They're still alive. They're just crippled basically from their job. And capital's like, well, if you're too injured to work, too old to work, too many injuries, health complications, we're just going to kick your ass to the curb and get a new guy. And that's pretty much what happens. The other aspect that Marx touches on just a little bit is this, like, nowadays we associate it with conservatives. I can't say the word conservatism. But it was just as true in Marx's writing as it is today. That, from the perspective of capital, early marriages where you have tons and tons of children to, replace your workforce is a good thing, right? They want a surplus population that is underemployed and desperate and will work at shitty jobs for shitty pay. That is absolutely in their interest. So when we see, discussions over abortion and like bodily autonomy stuff, most of their rhetoric around, like, life beginning at conception or whatever the fuck, it's basically rhetoric. It's completely fucking made up. They're just grasping at straws. What they're really interested in is a massive undereducated, underemployed, and desperate surplus population, because they're much, much easier to exploit. That, just plain and simple, that is exactly what they're after. Another caveat that I don't, Marx, maybe he does touch on this slightly, but the other caveat is that, this large surplus population isn't just for industry. It's also great for warmongering, if you're into that kind of thing. And believe me, the capitalists are very much into that thing. They would love nothing more than a massive, surplus of young, disinterested and unemployed people to send over to war to fucking die in some ridiculous war. They they'd be licking their chops. So, anyways, yeah, I guess that is interesting. I'm trying to think if I like recall that like a specific example where they're like, "Hey, stop having kids." I mean, I guess like China's like really the only example I can think of, but they were pretty much full on in their like early socialist transition at that point, which is pretty distinct from any capitalist organization. So yeah, okay, yeah, yeah, right, yeah. No, I can see that happening. Yeah. All right. Second category here, latent. So this one's mostly with respect to agricultural workers, as far as I can tell. Um, so they can, I guess, basically his point is that like as capitalist agriculture develops, you see the exact same trend where you need less and less manual labor. You know, as things get automated, you got bigger and bigger plows and harvesters, planters, whatever. Um, that means you got an outflow of labor from what were they could still be wage laborers, but like they're wage laborers working in agriculture migrate uh, away from that situation and into the towns where they have more heavy industry, and so on. Um, the other aspect of this has to do with sort of like seasonal workers. So you can seasonally work in like an agricultural setting. So for example, if it's like, hey, it's harvest season, we need people to harvest, but harvest season doesn't last all year. The rest of the year, you're gonna have to do something else, basically. Nikolai, are we gonna jump in there? Oh, sorry, I thought you were gonna comment on that one. Okay, gotcha, gotcha. All right. Oh, sick. Huh. All right. All right. All right. That is pretty cool. Um. All right. The last one is stagnant. The stagnant population. So these are like the most kind of destitute people out there. So whether it's really irregular employment, a lot of like terrible working hours for not much pay at all. The domestic industry is what Marx said is like kind of its most common thing. I think nowadays that would be referred to as sweatshops. I think that's what David Harvey said. Um, this is also the fastest growing portion of the surplus population, at least according to Marx in his era. And then, typically family size inversely related to income. I think the other, I think it was Ithar maybe who brought this up last week. But the most contemporary example of this is probably like the gig economy. Um, or maybe it's Greg. I don't. One of y'all brought this up. I don't remember who, but yeah, the modern gig economy is a pretty decent example of like what a modern stagnant population looks like, where it's like very inconsistent in employment. The pay is usually shitty. The hours are usually really shitty. You can get fired at the drop of a hat, or same like also think of like Amazon warehouses, right? Apparently those places are just burning through workers like fucking paper. They're People get burned out like crazy, and they're just like, all right, whatever, get a new one in. Yeah. So those are kind of fourth category that I didn't put here, but Mark sort of does go at length on a little bit is the like pauperism or the paupers, which is basically just like um, essentially the lumpen proletariat. Uh, I think is what Marx refers to them as more or less, which is essentially like people who cannot, for whatever reason, cannot work at all. So it could be due to like disability, again, like maybe severe injury or really old age. Again, kind of think about a time before um, saving for retirement was a thing. Even nowadays, saving for retirement is still not a thing for a lot of people because they just simply can't afford to save that kind of money. Need that money to survive day to day. So when they do get quite old, and they can't find work, what are you supposed to do, right? If you don't have any savings at that age, you're kind of shit out of luck. Um, and boy, I think that problem is going to be pretty colossal in whenever people my age start retiring, or maybe even uh, mid 30s, early 40s people. Basically, when people of our generation start retiring, it's gonna well, sorry, reach retirement age. It's gonna be bad because I'm gonna assume a lot of us don't have appropriate savings, and won't have appropriate savings by then. Yeah, I tried to amend myself halfway through saying that. I was like, not actually retirement, like retirement age. When we were all 65, we're just gonna be like, well, hey, 65 is just a number. I'm still fucking working out here. Like retirement, what's that? I mean, to be honest, that trend is already kind of happening, right? Wasn't it in? isn't that like part of what the French protests were all about? Is like increasing the retirement age, like and right and worse benefits when you do retire. Yeah, of course, of course. All right, last part of 25 here. Marx's sort of grand statement of this general law. So, the general law here is basically all this adds up to is that the greater the social wealth, greater the industrial reserve army. The greater the industrial reserve army, the greater the mass of the surplus population. The greater the surplus population is, the greater is the pauperism. In other words, poverty, basically. Pauperism, I just think of it as just old school terminology for poverty. Um, and in this quote, which I really admire, it's I think one of the more uh, I don't even can't even think of a word. I don't know, profound statements in the text. Um, this is the so-called immiseration thesis, but it's pretty profound and pretty damn accurate, if you ask me. So he says it makes an accumulation of misery a necessary condition corresponding to the accumulation of wealth. Accumulation of wealth at one pole is therefore at the same time accumulation of misery, torment of labor, slavery, ignorance, brutalization, and moral degradation at the opposite pole, i.e., on the side of the class that produces its own product as capital. So, this is arguably what he's been building up to throughout the text, is the statement that basically, if you let capitalism run its course, um, it's going to make everyone's lives more miserable. Just straight up. Like, things will get shittier with time as capital accumulates, and hard to say he was wrong on that one because let's see, when did he die? 1880 or something like that. So probably what, you had the First World War 30 years after his death, and then a Second World War right after that. And then a lot of crazy shit going down in the 20th century, and shit's still getting crazier by the day in the current century. Yes, that's a good point too. And I'll just comment on this too because I felt like I needed to review chapter 25 because the recording got lost. Um, I did not go over section 5 of chapter 25, which is the longest section. But it's also where Marx includes all of the uh, more contemporary and like empirical examples of this general law in motion. Um, where he looks at most of the examples he looks at are in or around England and Ireland. Um, although of course England kind of at the time being basically the center of the world market, more or less. It's essentially like it was the imperial core of its day. Um, it's a pretty damn good example, of course. Um, I know he's pretty bullish on the fact that like England is this sort of like classic example, like this England is the model for this stuff, and that all other countries will follow. And I think that is mostly correct. Of course, every different context is going to bring different factors into play. Um, whether it's just what type of resources are available, geopolitical. There's a lot of geopolitical factors that go into economics that Marx tends to abstract away from. He's not too concerned about that kind of thing. But obviously, in real world history, that is a big factor. Um, so like he can abstract England's position as like a global superpower at the time and just say, it doesn't really matter. They're just like the poster child of capitalist development. And so we can say, well, a little bit of yes, a little bit of no. England's position as a imperial superpower was pretty fucking relevant for its capitalist development. And in fact, there's been a lot of work and a lot of theory and texts written about capitalist development in non-imperial contexts, like imperial periphery and so forth. So, and obviously Lenin did a lot of analysis of that kind of stuff in imperialism, where capitalism begins to sort of spread outward from the imperial core and into the imperial periphery when it needs to search for kind of fertile soil, so to speak. So, suffice to say, this is the general trend. This is the general law. The specific manifestation of the law is going to depend on, you guessed it, material conditions and probably historical context. That's why I think the general part of the law, is intentional, right? This is a general trend, a general law that we can observe in any context, but the specifics of what it looks like in any given context is gonna change, depend on which context you're looking at. So that's, I think, maybe the best way of thinking of this statement. Big theses coming out of the book. Okay, so let's get on to the new chapters. They're significantly shorter, so we can breeze through these, no problem. But there's interesting stuff to think about here. So, chapter 26 is all about primitive accumulation. So, Marx he starts out by sort of reviewing that, he says, well, I kind of laid all this stuff out as very cyclical, right? We have this scheme of simple reproduction, which sort of implies a cyclical nature of the whole thing, right? We've got to produce at the very minimum, we have to produce what we did last year, so on and so forth. Back over because the way fast. Up. What page am I looking for? So he gives a nice outline in this paragraph here of what primitive accumulation is all about. This says, this primitive accumulation plays approximately the same role in political economy as original sin does in theology. Adam bit the apple, and thereupon sin fell on the human race. Its origin is supposed to be explained when it is told as an anecdote about the past. Long, long ago, there were two sorts of people. One, the diligent, intelligent, and above all, frugal elite. The other, lazy rascals, spending their substance and more on riotous living. The legend of theological original sin tells us certainly how man came to be condemned to eat his bread in the sweat of his brow. But the history of economic original sin reveals to us that there are people to whom this is by no means essential. Never mind. Thus it came to pass that the former sort of accumulated wealth, and the latter sort, finally had nothing to sell except their own skins. And from this original sin dates the poverty of the great majority, who, despite their labor, have up to now nothing to sell but themselves. Wealth of the few that increases constantly, though they have long ceased to. Such insipid childishness is every day preached to us in defense of property. So pretty good intro there. Mark's kind of flexing his bros a little bit, which is always fun. Um, but yeah, he's based. This is the myth, right? Really? I mean, some of it's dry as fuck, but sometimes he's like, I think it's kind of fun. No, that's true. Didn't have a good editor. I mean, this book could probably be like 400 or 500 pages if he was just way, way more brief and actually use citations the way citations are intended to be used, which is not just quoting an entire fucking report inside of your book. I mean, he has literally hundreds of citations, but he cites in like the weirdest way possible, which is direct quoting. I mean, it's just I got what you were saying. But at the same time, it's like he does not need more citations. He has too many. He needs to chill on his citations. Yeah. No, he I mean, some of the footnotes are absolutely ridiculous. Anyways, yeah. So what he's shitting on in this paragraph is the myth of political economy that has been fed to us, and by the way, still gets fed to us on a daily basis. Um, I know variations of this were basically taught in my history, like my world history class, basically, um, like back in high school or whatever. But you got this idea of like, oh well, the rich became rich because they were frugal, like they didn't spend it. They were very clever. They invested well. They made good investments, good decisions, good bets or whatever. Whereas the rest of us who are broke and have to work for the rest of our lives, we're all just lazy or stupid or just weren't smart with our money. We spent it all on drugs and alcohol, and oh no, I need a job now. Well, yeah, and what a contradiction that is, by the way, right? Is it like I'm pretty sure the actual like debaucherous people, like the most debaucherous people out there in the modern era, are probably very wealthy people. Just they have so much money they don't even know what to do with it, so they just like do crazy fucked up shit just because they can. It's certainly evidence in that direction. Yes, that is definitely the case. Uh, but yeah, I mean, it just goes to show them that myth is exactly that. It's a myth. Stupid, clearly made up, definitely propaganda. So what Marx goes over in this chapter is that actually the real history, the actual citations say what really happened is that you had capitalists versus the working class. So the capitalists sort of moved in and replaced the old guild masters and feudal lords, landowners, aristocrats, that kind of thing. Um, and they did this basically by taking control of the means of production through conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder. In short, force. Just direct force. Um, and the working class are ultimately the victims of this, where they get displaced from their land, from their homes. They also get their own means of production taken away from them, so like tools. Um, Ultimately, the ability to basically um, support themselves, which, economy. It's what was ultimately taken from them. And so he says, so-called primitive accumulation, therefore, is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the meat production. So he says workers are freed in a double sense. They're not owned as slaves anymore, or serfs. So you could argue that because serfs are sort of tied to the land, and the land is owned by a landlord, a lord of the land. Serfs are kind of, sort of owned by their lords. Owned is maybe not the correct terminology there, but you're pretty darn close to being a commodity at that point. But wage workers are distinct from serfs and distinct from slaves in the fact that they are quote unquote free. And they're not owned by individual person, but they're also freed from their own means of production because they do not own their own shit now. And so they're basically forced to sell themselves into servitude in 8-hour shifts, for example. And so yeah, this process basically dates back at least to the 16th century, maybe even further. So yeah, that's really how the biscuits got buttered, basically. In words. Next, we got the expropriation of the agricultural population from the land. This one's kind of interesting. So you have, I still don't even know what yeomanry fucking is, but I mean, independent peasants, I guess. But am I the only one who, when I see yeoman, I think of like isn't yeoman like one of the roles on like the Star Trek ships? I'm not a big Star Trek guy, but like I remember. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I don't know what a yeoman is in like naval terminology. I have no idea what the role of a yeoman is. Clearly, it's not a peasant. Yeah. Well, anyways, it's a funny word mostly. Um, but yeah, point is these sort of peasants basically got booted off the land. And it was actually really interesting to see Marx. Who is? Oh, I don't know. Maybe. Yeah, I have no idea. Hell, maybe I'll just start calling myself a yeoman. See if anyone notices. Just be like, wait, what the fuck does that mean? That's like it means whatever I damn well want it to mean. Anyways, what I think the most interesting part of this chapter was kind of Marx putting some of the pieces together of what sort of happened to these peasants. So, like, one thing that was interesting is when you have the enclosure of the commons, for example, they would basically like, so land that was previously used to grow crops, basically, got replaced with sheep. And I mean, in England, that makes sense because they have a shit ton of sheep. Even to this day, they do. But it kind of, Marx is like, oh, well, clearly that was sort of something that happened due to the cotton industry. Or not cotton, like wool, textiles, weaving and that kind of thing. Like, basically, they needed the wool from all this sheep. So they're like, well, that's the most profitable thing. So let's, these crops that people eat, fuck that. We're not doing that anymore. Get these peasants out of here so we can just put sheep out here to graze. and we can get like, a handful of people to shear the sheep a couple times a year. Um, and so like that is at least one example of kicking peasants off the land. And so suddenly you've got a big mass of peasants that are like unemployed. They don't have anywhere to work or live. And so they're like, fuck, I guess I had to go to the town and, go work for somebody. I got to work for somebody else now. I can't just work my own land. And there we go. I mean, that's exactly what we're talking about, right? We're separating the producer from the means of production is one necessary condition to get your capitalism going. And so, this is point two here, right? This is essentially replacing one system of private property with another. And the point is to drive people into the towns and the manufacturing centers, and ultimately basically creating a working class. And this is next chapter. This was not done peacefully, surprisingly enough. And this one's called the Bloody Legislation Against the Expropriated. So this quote from that website with the notes and stuff says the conversion of peasants and artisans into wage and potentially wage workers involved a long and brutal campaign by capital to drive the freed, quote unquote, population into the labor market. A campaign whose difficulty was due to resistance documented in centuries of bloody legislation aimed at its suppression. So yeah, the peasants didn't just leave their land peacefully and without resistance. That's, ridiculous. Obviously, there's a ton of class struggle going on at this time. And this is also where we start to see the state get involved as it's increasingly kind of shifting its allegiance, let's say, away from the feudal, like landed gentry towards the rising bourgeoisie. And that the rising bourgeoisie kind of needs the state in order to achieve its goals. And so, yeah, you've got stuff like lengthening the working day, maximum. Imagine Congress setting a maximum wage. That is fucking insane. Oh, man, I would love to see them try, though. Good God, that'd be a sight to see. And then, of course, you've got outlawing, combinations, contracts, and oaths. This is another way of saying outlawing unions, basically, and collectives, co-ops, that kind of thing. This wasn't super clear that this is between workers, right? Worker combinations, worker contracts, worker co-ops, and that sort of thing. That shit gets outlawed pretty much immediately in the early stages because you can't have workers organizing too early. You can't have them organizing at all, preferably if you're a capitalist. So they get rid of that shit. Go ahead. Right? Yeah. Yeah. No, I think I guess it was like, if you think about it, it's sort of like it is a form of regulation, obviously, but it's like a regulation that is so aggressively anti-worker because you're basically saying, like, hey, you capitalist who's paying your workers well so you can, hire the most workers or get the best workers, like, you can't do that. That's illegal. It's unfair. Right? It's like, it's so psychotic. All right, last part here. Again, mostly English specific context for the most part. So your mileage may vary on some of these things, but talking about more about the agricultural side of things. So this was called The Genesis of the Capitalist Farmer. So the expropriation of the agricultural population only created great landed proprietors, and that this process was very slow and evolved over centuries. So he lays out the case for England, at least, saying that it started with bailiffs, which are basically like serfs. Um, uh, see, models it after this Roman villicus. I'm not sure what that is, but if I remember correctly, this is basically um, sort of like an independent serf who can hire other people. I think, right? It's like you're a serf. In other words, you work for a lord, basically. But I think you're still free to hire basically like prototypical wage laborers. Like you can hire hands to work your fields, basically. Like you don't have to work your fields yourself. Um, I think that's what the first form is. And then the second form is when you have uh, the landlord and the farmer sort of cooperating a little bit more. So this is where you have the seeds of basically like the capitalist providing the means of production to their workers. Right. So the landlord gives like the seed, the cattle, implements, tools, um, along with the land, so that the farmer can more effectively put people to work, basically. And again, the farmer is basically the overseer in this case, basically. Then he has this métayer, or whatever word that is, basically a sharecropper. Um, advances parts of inputs, rest advanced by landowner, and then they divide the output. So uh, now our farmers, we don't have like a middleman farmer now. Like everyone's basically just being working directly for their landlord, more or less. Um, and then you have finally the capitalist farmer, who pretty typical. They buy the land purely for capital investment, and they just pay people to work there. And if they live on the land as well, then they also pay rent, which is just fucking strange, man. Like, man, you're not only. It's so funny that, like, oh, you're getting paid to work the field. Well, let me get a chunk of that back just because you live here. What the fuck? Ugh, stupid. Um, yeah. So this is going on in the 15th and 16th centuries. Um, so this is also where you got like the expansion of cattle, manure, sheep, so forth, where you're converting common, usually agricultural land, into private land for the purposes of raising livestock. Um, and yeah, you've basically got money starts getting involved more, fall in value of gold, rises the prices of everything, which undermines real wages and rents, raising surplus value and profits. Yay. So now he suggests that by the end of the 16th century, you've got a pretty solid base of capitalist. That's sort of the progression that he tracks in the chapter. Again, is some more interesting history stuff, I suppose. But yeah, again, these are much shorter chapters. They're almost like little self-contained vignettes. Yeah. All right, that's what I got for the slides. You guys got any more comments, questions, concerns? I had some similar thoughts actually. I think it's in the section on Ireland at the end of 25. Um, he mentions like Cromwell a few times, right? And it's a lot of that's kind of mentioned in passing, like oh you should already be familiar with the history. I mean, shit, it's been a minute since fucking middle or high school history class, so I don't remember much about the um the bourgeois revolution in England, that like the Cromwell stuff. But yeah, I agree with you that like it would be very interesting to hear what Marx has to say about um like specifically, yeah, how did the English bourgeoisie like actually seize power? Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, I think that's probably one of Marx's like most bold claims, I guess, is that uh you know, England is the classic case, right? I think that's like the exact words he uses. And it's like, is it though? Because England seems like a very specific case. Um, yeah. Yeah. And that's where a lot of like, I know David Harvey talks about this in his lecture a lot, right? About the, like, Marx is plays pretty fast and loose with the, is this a logical deductive argument or is this a historical contextual argument? And he plays fast and loose with it. You can I think we've done a pretty okay job at like identifying which chapters are typically which, right? Because like you can kind of tell when he's doing like a hypothetical, almost like a thought experiment versus this is what actually happened in real life. And I get it, right? Like as a social scientist, he is trying to match the theory to the data, right? Like that is ultimately what what you're doing in a scientific endeavor, is like coming up with a model that explains the data. And I think his model is pretty good. It pretty comprehensive, captures a lot of the dynamics, maybe not all of them, but quite a few of them, and makes pretty accurate predictions. But there's just a lot of English specific stuff going on that doesn't cleanly translate to other contexts. But I think you have to give him credit that like when you do start zooming out, you get the big picture of what happens under capitalist development. He's pretty much on the money. Like he's got the big picture pretty much nailed. The other thing I'll add is that I can definitely understand how Marx probably just literally did not have the time or energy to like thoroughly analyze other modes of production, um, as thoroughly as he did the capitalist one. So it does not surprise me at all that he just ignores the rest of the world and is like, let's just do one country for now. Even in Europe, even in Europe, he was like, it wasn't he banned from like half of Europe for being a fucking agitator? Yeah, yeah. He had to write about England whether he liked it or not. England's the only place he could live. I think all maybe Belgium as well. I don't know. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he got banned like everywhere he tried to live, basically. I'm sure Marx got kicked out of his fair share of bars too. A time honored tradition. That is also a time honored communist tradition.